Today is to keep this panel online, and just following what Dave Swenson said, the industry that you're working is the most important. This is the most important panel of the day. So let me kind of do a quick introduction, and what we'll do, we'll take each person in order as you're listed on the program here. So the first speaker is Paul Trombino. He's our director of the Iowa DOT. Not to say, transportation is the most important thing, but, my life as Director of Transportation Research and faculty member in transportation, I think it is. So, next would be followed by Dee Brown, Director of Energy Delivery Operations Support for Alliant Energy, followed by Professor Weber, who is the Director of IIHR and a fellow colleague in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And then we'll wrap up the formal presentations with Mark Schouten.
Schouten, fine.
Who is the Director of the Homeland Security for Iowa. So with that, 15 minutes for the first speaker, and then followed by two. And I like to keep time, so when you hear my dog bark, I'll cut you off.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Again, I agree with Paul's assessment that transportation is the most important thing because every single person every day makes a transportation decision. And that's why it is that important. Whether it's consciously or unconsciously, we're all making a transportation decision about where we're going to go. So what I have today here is really three pieces that I'm going to show about a lot of things going on at the department when it comes to weather. I always like to say that, give my introduction, I started with Iowa DOT in actually May 9th of 2011. And at that time, as I've gone through floods, 2008 floods. I actually experienced that in Wisconsin. And so one of my first issues was trying to get an assessment, what's going on. There was some flooding at the time along Mississippi. Talked to my chief engineer. I've told this story before. His name's John Adams, still there. Great individual. And so we got all my group together. I'm like, okay, so is there any flooding issues, anything going on? And John's like, oh no, there's nothing going on. All of it's down south. We have a couple bridges, and there's really nothing going on. All of it's down in Missouri. And I said, great. I just want to see what emergency operation. How do you guys handle it? How do you guys handle all that kind of stuff? He's like, yeah, we'll meet in a couple of weeks. That was May 9th, really, May 10th. And by about the May 20th, we basically had one of the largest flooding events in the history of the western side of the state along the Missouri. So that was sort of my baptism, as I like to say. I still joke to John about that because he told me nothing was going on, and then all of a sudden we were having the worst floods that we experienced that essentially lasted all summer long and engulfed basically most of the roadway system along the west side of the state. And that kind of brings us back to, for my perspective, one of the key points is for us when we talk about weather and infrastructure is preparation. The department has spent a lot of time, especially since I've been here, we've spent a lot of time preparing. That's the key ingredient for us to really be able to deal with a lot of climate change issues and understanding some of the issues out there. We have a big constraint, as I like to say. That is the transportation system. It's not easy to pick up and move, okay? Mm-hmm. It is a point of constraint for us, and people have the expectation that it be utilized 24/7, 365 days a year. And these are just a couple pictures. One is Interstate 80. That was obviously before I got here, and the other one is Cedar Rapids, the one Mr. Swenson just talked about. And so this last 2 years, we've worked very hard at doing what is called National Incident Management, NIMS system training, incident command structure for essentially the entire department, getting us ready for emergency preparedness and how to operate, how to function, how to be able to adjust to those issues. We actually are approving right now between ourselves and Department of Public Safety. I actually have a copy of it because we just went through it yesterday. Our Emergency Transportation Operations Plan, which is essentially a structure for us to deal with any type of emergency issue out there as we function and operate the transportation system. We've done formal tabletop exercises, all as a part between ourselves and Department of Public Safety. in regards to any type of issue, from winter to flooding and other things that happen sort of in between. One of the areas I think has always been very important is really operating the system. That is really the fundamental piece of what we do every day. It's how people function on it. And we have made some adjustments in our structure to really get focused on system operations, and that's really operating all the entire transportation system, the connectivity issues that are very important there. And that gets to getting beyond partnership. A lot of times we talk about between agencies or other organizations, we talk about partnership, but really integrating our operations, really functioning day to day together. And I have a lot of examples of that, but public safety is one of the key runs because of what we do on the transportation system. And that has been a key ingredient for us to really improve our preparedness, improve our ability to respond, and mitigate a lot of those issues as we go forward. And that gets to really doing that all the time. What that kind of turns to is vulnerability assessments. That's one of the things that we've been spending some time. A lot of the agencies, I think if you go to other states, are really trying to get a vulnerability assessment of their transportation network, and then trying to understand what things they can do because of the constraint that they really are dealt with, just like we are. One of the things that is pretty impressive, that since I've had the opportunity to come to the state of Iowa, are the tools that we have. And a lot of these tools, as I spent 17 years in Wisconsin, do not exist in the state of Wisconsin. And so we have a tremendous LiDAR system that really has us the ability to create a ground service. And it essentially covers the state. You see the little map of it up on the top side of this area. It allows us to really, as flooding and inundation happens, project what's going to happen. It allows us to then mitigate some of those issues as best we can. Not necessarily can we do all of them, but sort of being able to predict that inundation. And we did a lot of that on the west side of the state in 2011. That made us very effective to hopefully help adjust and sort of offset some of the impacts of transportation. And there were a lot of methods that we ended up trying that ended up in the end saving some potential damage to those transportation investments and help sort of offset some of that and mitigate that cost issue. We have a pretty amazing GPS system. The department actually developed this. It was implemented in 2009. We have 82 base stations across the state. And part of that reason goes to the accuracy of the system. Think of it when we do real estate and construction, and if we're buying somebody's land, we need accuracy about like this and like that, both vertical and horizontal. I can't use a TomTom or somebody else's GPS when we're out there laying that out. It just won't work. And that gives us a distinct advantage about managing our assets, ultimately understanding impacts across the system, and we're in sort of that process of taking those and really into an active management process. And that, and you think about that, when it sort of gets to a GIS sort of portal, it allows us to sort of look at the entire asset all at once, predict inundation, predict other types of activity on the system, and that gets to tabletops exercises. It even gets to the point of managing the issue in real time. You can do that with the GIS portal and be able to redirect or understand how the system is being impacted and changes in that system, whether it be maybe a significant weather event that's affecting a school, and then how do you move those people in and around depending on the impact of the rest of the transportation system. It makes it very powerful for us, and that's something that we're formulating right now, and a lot of that we're going to get out into the hands of what I say, our customers, all of you. We want people to have the ability to be able to use that data and, in their best regards from an emergency preparedness, ultimately, process perspective. The next one is really creation of Traffic Operations Center. We're right now in the process of creating what I was really upgrading our traffic operations, really called the TOC in a lot of states, Traffic Management Center. And we're proposing to build that in the Ankeny office in the basement there, and eventually, long term, share that and become a joint communication center with the Department of Public Safety. So you have one center really concentrated managing the transportation network, being able to communicate directly, not only with the public, but with direct customers. And that sort of gets to the shift the department's really working on, is sort of what a lot of commonly referred to as crowdsourcing, but sort of getting information from individuals, consuming that, because ultimately the travelers on the system, people interacting on all parts of the transportation system, whether it be road, rail, water, air, whatever it is, and consuming that helps us get better information about the system, better predictability, better assessment of what impacts are, and with the technology today, we have the ability to communicate directly. And that's sort of that future where crowdsourcing really gives us better information about the system and allows us to respond directly to issues on that. And it makes it more powerful for people to make decisions about potential impacts to them on the system. The next piece is policy. One of the challenges that has been sort of ongoing, especially at the federal level, is the challenge with the way the policy is really set out when we have impacts such as those on Interstate 680, a lot of those that happened in the Cedar Rapids area, and I know University of Iowa has been going through this from a different agency level. But the reimbursement. There were a lot of times when we were getting ready and really designing a lot of things on the fly for rebuilding parts along Interstate 680 or other parts of Interstate 29, and we wanted to add some what maybe was just referred to, some hardening of the system to make it more resilient against future impacts. And with the federal level, we were told you can do that, but you have to pay for 100% of the costs. We can only rebuild the system exactly as it was, and that's what we would get reimbursed from the federal level. That's a disconnect, okay, with the problem, because if it ends up getting impacted again 2 years from now, they end up just paying the whole thing all over again, which means all of us are paying for it all over again. Doesn't make a lot of sense, and that was something that we had a lot of conversation with. I actually went to D.C. and talked to Federal Highways, Victor Mendez, who's a FHWA administrator, and we had a lot of conversation about that. And that was one of the things they're trying to change. I believe they actually tried to loosen that a little bit, but it really is an issue that needs to be resolved long term. The other thing that is interesting about the transportation network, and all of our funding really comes through emergency relief, we call it ER funds, is how they deal with the cycle of the flood. So Interstate 680's flood was interesting in the sense of obviously a lot of that flow of water coming down through South Dakota started essentially really the end of May. The water didn't recede until September, and the way the law at the federal level is really set up is it says, okay, at the time of impact, technically you think of a flash flood. It rains a lot, we get a flash flood, takes usually a few days. Well, at the end of that, when the flood ends, or essentially when the flood begins, you have 6 months to repair and then be eligible within that 6 months to get 100% of those cost backs from the federal to repair the system. So for us, that 6 months, even though we didn't have access to the system because it was really underwater until really September, the time ran out on the clock in November. We essentially had till November in order to get 100% reimbursement. Otherwise, it starts to tick downward, and we would end up, as a state, absorbing that cost to fix the system. On the good side, we found a way to fix all of that and do it within the time frame that we were given, so that we did get essentially $46 million back from USDOT, so that we could reimburse that cost. Otherwise, it would be essentially costs that the state would bear as a whole. So that really is a challenge out there. That's something that needs to be rectified again, because of the way the floods are happening. They're not a consistent rainfall that happens over 2 days and we have a flash flood and then we all turn around and fix it all up. That is not what's happening today, and what we expect in the future, that a lot of these could be much longer term, and so we really need to look at the policy of how we implement and deal with those issues. The next one is really, I want to talk a little bit about rural bridge issues and changing demand. And a lot of that gets to, a lot of it gets to transportation funding. We've talked a little bit about this. But it also gets to the system as it exists today. And this is a map that I like to show. This is structurally deficient bridges essentially not on the primary highway system, only in the local system. And remember, our transportation system is really interconnected. And so the X's, if you can see them, are essentially closed bridges. The green dots are bridges that are open, structurally deficient. And then the sort of the orangey diamonds are also structurally deficient bridges, but they're posted, meaning they have a limited weight value. But now if you think of that from a weather-related perspective, a lot of these bridges were really built in 1900s to 1930, 20, 40, 50, really built under a different time, likely under a different climate model, okay? And what I was trying to show this, and one of the reasons I want to show you is that this is a risk. This will have an impact depending on whatever climate likely change happens or weather-related incident happens. These are going to have a direct related impact because if somebody said, well, why don't you just fix all those, this sort of gets to the affordability issue that we talk about quite often. It's, quite frankly, not affordable. And so, but the way they're designed right now is likely not to a standard that we would consider today, and this is going to lead to my next piece, and which means they're going to have an impact. They're likely going to flood people's lands. They're going to flood people's homes because they become the pinch points along a lot of different tributaries and riverways across the system, and ultimately impact breakages, essentially, in the transportation system. So that is something that's before us that ultimately I think we as a state are going to have to make some decisions about of how we want to deal with that system. Because against what I say, bridges close themselves. There's really nothing we have to do, and that's exactly what this is doing. And we only have, on the local system, you have about 16,000 more bridges to go. So, it's, I always like to say eventually the map's going to look like that AT&T Verizon commercial. It's going to be like a big blob. We're all trying to figure out what it is. But that's the path that we're on. I'm going to do a couple things. I want to do, one of the things is predictability, reliability. It's really hardening the system is the key ingredient. We've done quite a bit of this. US 65, the bridge is right outside of Des Moines, really helping relieve a lot of things downtown, allowing flow. That's been a key ingredient. And this sort of gets to our crystal ball. One of the things that we're working on right now is forecast with weather. If you think about how design happens today, we essentially forecast traffic demand 30, 40 years out. That's how we end up designing the roadway systems, how we think about the bridge system. But when you design it when you start thinking of a bridge, we actually go backwards. We go the reverse way. We say, okay, what's the 100-year flood based on all the data that we have? Because we have a lot of data, right, for 150 years or 100 years, whatever you want to call it. We don't really have a lot of data. What we're going to do right now, the concept, and both University of Iowa and Iowa State University is helping with us, is to forecast the other way with weather based on a series of climate models. And basically try to predict future 100-year flood, because that's changing, okay, because of the changes that we're seeing ultimately in the weather. And the concept then is to have that as a part, ultimately, of a strategy as we move forward on some segments of roadway. And there are some segments of roadway that are more important than others, not just the street that I live on, but there are some that are more important. And that gets to what we're sort of focusing on here, is sort of that adaptation strategy. Here's some of the main basins. We're trying this right now in Skunk River Basin, and really trying to focus on that, because that's some of the impact that we've seen on Interstate 80. Here's Interstate 80. I think everyone's driven it enough. If Skunk River, as I showed you before, has an impact, here's what the workaround is, about 120 miles. Not very good. People are not going to be happy. It's going to have an economic impact, I think. We can calculate it. So what we're working on right now is that future climate modeling, and think of it going forward. It is a significant change. It's a significant philosophical change from a civil engineering perspective. And I'm very excited about this. We had grant dollars from USDOT to help us with this issue, and I think in the future it's really going to have a profound effect on a lot of national standards about how we move forward in the future. There you go. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to start today by just sharing a little bit about Alliant Energy. I'm going to talk about the system impacts that we've had with the storms that we've had over the last few years, how we plan for those storms, how we respond and recover from those storms, how we are dealing and looking to the future, and what we've learned from those storms. So first of all, we're an investor-owned utility, the second in the state, Mid-American being the largest. The one thing you don't hear a lot about us during storm restoration, either us or Mid-American, you hear a lot about outages and recovery and things like that, but then it's pretty much over. And primarily it's the reason to, I think Bill's point, you know, they thought they were getting FEMA money and they don't. Well, we're lucky in the fact that we don't have to worry about it because we don't qualify. So we don't even get started. Anything that happens to our system, our customers are forced to pay for. Same with the with Mid-Americans. So it's just part of being an investor-owned utility. We're a very rural utility. We serve about 1 million customers in Iowa, southern Minnesota, and Wisconsin. We have 9,000 miles of gas line and about 40,000 miles of electric distribution infrastructure. To give you just a little bit of background about how utility works, in case you don't know, it starts with the generating plants. You'll find that a lot of our generating plants are along rivers because they need water for a resource. They generate power. It goes into the transmission lines that go across the state. The transmission, think of transmission line as your interstate highways. Then we go down to substation where the voltage is reduced to a distribution level that goes through distribution lines that run in front of your homes and businesses, and a transformation that transforms it down to the voltage in which you use in your homes and your businesses. So just in case people don't know, we like to give a little bit of background. Alliant has had the privilege, I guess for lack of a better word, of having a lot of impacts over the last few years. We started in 2007 with double ice storms, February of 2007. We've heard a lot today about flooding, but we don't talk a lot about ice storms, and we have those in this state. In 2007, in February, we were hit with one of the largest ice storms in history. It hit the transmission system very hard. Didn't hit our distribution system as hard, which seems strange, but the transmission, and you can see in the top picture, those are transmission poles down around Ottumwa that basically large steel structures that just bent over and the wire was laying on the ground. When transmission lines go down, they take out a lot of customers at one time. When you put them back up, you bring back a lot of customers at one time, but it takes a lot of time to put them back in the air. In 2008, or at the end of 2007, December of 2007, we had another ice storm that hit basically the same territory as the February ice storm hit. Those customers were feeling very privileged at that point in time. And that was more of a distribution storm. Took down a lot of the distribution line. It was heavily impacted trees, which brought down a lot of lines. And that takes longer to bring up all the customers. You bring up some customers, you can bring it up faster, but you bring up smaller customers at a time because it's smaller infrastructure. So the impacts are far-reaching for our customers when the storms hit us. The impacts are really big on the customers as far as being out of power. And for businesses, they send their employees home. They're not able to meet their deadlines. So it does impact our customers. It also impacts our communities. Communities, we had a lot of challenges with the ice storms. We brought generators in to those communities just so they could run their wastewater treatment plants and pump water because they were out of power long enough as it took a long time. Because if you remember that February storm, we got hit with the storm, and 2 days later we got hit with a blizzard that really made a step back a long ways. Also has a huge impact on the economy, and I'll talk a little bit more about that with the flood of 2008 when it hit Cedar Rapids and the impact. But from a company perspective, in 2007, those two ice storms cost us, or our customers, $65 million. In 2008, the floods cost us $1 million. Now that seems like that's small compared to the ice storms. Well, that's because we have an insurance policy that kicked in after $1 million or $100 million. So our customers covered the first, or us, covered the first $100 million, and the next few $100 million after that were covered by our insurance. I don't know if those numbers are even included in the impacts that occurred in the economy because, again, we don't qualify for any type of assistance from a recovery. So many ask us, can we control reliability? And the answer is yes and no. We operate at almost 100% reliability. Our reliability rates are about 99.98%, which is very high, which means the power flows the majority of the time. We can't control the severity or the frequency of the weather, and we certainly can't control the geographic location. This spring we were hit with an ice storm up in southwest Minnesota. Didn't impact a lot of customers, took a lot of miles of line down, again, a very rural area. What we can control is our planning and our preparation, and we spend a lot of time doing that. Our response and recovery is very important, and our customers expect us to do a phenomenal job at that. Integrity and reliability of the electric system and the natural gas infrastructure is very important. And we make investments, the investments we make are long-term. We don't make short-term decisions because those systems are out there for 60 to 80 years is the average, 60 years is the average life of an electric distribution line. So from a planning and preparation, this happens to be our Cedar Rapids operating facility, which at the beginning of the predictions of the flood would be dry throughout it. So we planned to work out of that facility. We plan and prepare a lot. We do a lot of drills. We work a lot to be ready for those events. What we weren't prepared for in Cedar Rapids on Thursday, June 10th, I believe it was that we not only lost Cedar Rapids operating, we lost 2 power plants, our distribution dispatch center, and our corporate office. So we lost all 5 facilities, which traditionally are the backup for each other. So we found ourselves homeless and looking for a place to operate out of and run our crews out of and have all of our trucks out of. So as we said, no plan is 100% effective, and all weather events are unique. But we deal with them, and we came to, what we found in Cedar Rapids was the problem was very different. Ice storms, Mother Nature puts it all on the ground. We go put it back up, all is good. With the flood, it didn't take the system down except for the downtown distribution system, which is an underground network. And obviously it was submersed in water and it took that system down. But it really didn't impact the rest of our system, which really made it hard on our crews because our crews are usually ready to go out, put it all back up, can't wait, ready to go. In this case, it was a very emotional time for them because they were out telling customers, I have to shut your power off. And because our system isn't built along flood lines, they would have to shut lines off that were to flooded homes, at the same time shutting power off to homes that were trying to keep their house, their sump pump running. So it was a very emotional time for them as they went through it. So we had programs in place for that as well. So we had comprehensive restoration event planning. We prepare for those events. Our restoration plans have to be practical, flexible, and manageable because we can never predict exactly what happens. We have to work our plan and focus on restoring most efficiently and effectively, not necessarily permanently to start with. In a lot of cases when we're making restoration, we will restore on a temporary basis just so we can get the lights back on or the gas flowing to the customer and go back later and do the final repairs. But the most critical thing is that we do it safely. The one thing that our product will deliver is it delivers a lot of comfort and things to your home. It's the one thing you can't see, but if you touch it, it'll kill you. And our crews are very critical to us, and they're the most important part of our company. So we keep their safety, and we try to preach to them, no matter how long a customer's in or out of power, it's not worth your safety. It's more important that you're alive tomorrow to restore power than to get a customer's power back on today. We do a lot of work with assessments and looking at the whole system as we do a recovery. Our plan is to recover the most customers first, so people that have a small service line out and they're the only person that's out on that block may be one of the last people to get back in service. That's always a challenge to explain to them, but we try to bring on the largest number of customers first with focus on the core utilities within the community, the water, the sewer plants, that type of stuff, then the hospitals, nursing homes, and schools so that we can restore life as close to possible as normal. We have a distribution dispatch center that dispatches all our crews and works with the local emergency management people as we restore the power. Communication is critical. When we were involved with the Cedar Rapids floods, we had a person located out at the Cedar Rapids emergency site so that we had communication. We needed them and they needed us. We needed them to help open up pathways for us to be able to travel throughout the community. Cedar Rapids was pretty much cut in half. 380 was the only way you could get from one side of the city to the other for the most part. And we had to be able to get our trucks from one place to the other. The Iowa DOT was critical. We had a transformer that we needed to rebuild a substation that flooded, and it was in Ames. We had to get it through Cedar Rapids, and it went up through Highway 20 and back down through 380 to get it. They had to let air out of tires on semis in order to get it under underpasses and things like that. We could have never done that without the Department of Transportation helping us. So working with public officials and emergency management people is critical, as well as communicating with our communities so that they know when to expect power to be restored and know what to anticipate so they can tell their their community citizens.
Dee, could you start wrapping up, please?
Okay. As far as planning, we plan for the future. We're trying to harden the system. We're trying to rebuild the system faster. It's being put in larger poles, stronger poles to withstand the winds and the ice. Undergrounding, a lot of people think that's the answer. It can be. It's very expensive. You have to do a balance between what customers can afford to pay for versus undergrounding and the impacts of it. It also, if you have an outage on an underground system, it takes a lot longer to restore than an overhead system. So it's not necessarily the only option or the best option. Mitigating transmission, we're rebuilding the transmission system, or ITC is as well. We'll have new substations. We're trying to relocate those out of the floodplains. The biggest challenge we have is people don't want them in their backyard or in their neighborhood. So floodplains are the nice place for them because nobody else wants to live there. So that's a challenge that we have in working with communities to place those. And then generation, obviously, water supply is critical. They had problems with the drought in 2012 of water supply to the Ottumwa generating plant. So what are we doing and what have we learned from our experiences? Well, we've learned that weather events are significant and they will continue. Extensive in planning and preparation are important. Each event is unique and you have to expect the unexpected. Our restoration plans have to be practical, flexible. We need to continue to implement the programs and we need to make investments for the long term and then know that there will be another event. It's not if, it's when and where for us. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. I'll spend about 10 minutes talking about some programs that we have at the Iowa Flood Center and as it in particular relates to infrastructure related issues in Iowa. My name is Larry Weber. I'm the director of IIHR Hydroscience and Engineering and co-founder of the Iowa Flood Center along with the current director of the Flood Center, Vitek Krajewski. The Flood Center, as you may know, we've been around in Iowa. We were formed in the 2009 legislative session with one-year funds. That continued for a few years as we went year by year with that early funding, and then just recently we're moved over into the governor's budget with the more recurring funding level for our support, and we greatly appreciate that support. The Flood Center was formed in response to the 2008 floods. At that time, we did think, and we were thinking about it a bit because we hadn't gotten into this recurrent pattern of flooding at that point, but what happens if we go into a dry year for a year or two? Fortunately or unfortunately, in 2009, we saw intense flash flooding in eastern Iowa. 2010, we had the Lake Delhi Dam failure. 2011, Missouri River under flood stage for a long period of time. And now we've gone into a drought cycle in 2012 and floods again in 13 and drought again in 13. And so now we're seeing this variability of flood and drought, which we used to think about in decadal cycles, now in interannual cycles, so flood and drought in the same year. And so we believe that the services of the Flood Center do help Iowa across the wide spectrum from flood to drought in our river forecasting, our stream sensing, and our community preparedness. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that. You see some of the photos here on the screen that show some of the instruments that we have. We have some radar that help to augment the National Weather Service's NextRad radar system that overlooks Iowa, that provides estimates of precipitation everywhere in Iowa. That information is really helpful for us in terms of running a statewide model that delineates Iowa into about 1 million hill slope and stream segments. So we're running a simulation model that updates about every 15 minutes that provides an updated stream flow at 1 million locations in Iowa. And that's really valuable information, not only during times of flood, but certainly times of drought as well as times in between. Some of the most important information that we need to drive that model are data. That data comes from USGS stream sensors, the NextRad radar system for precipitation. We've augmented the federal cooperative stream gauging system with about 200 water level sensors that we attach to bridges across the state of Iowa. And then just in this last year, we started to deploy a series of soil moisture and soil temperature probes. We did that very intensely in the Turkey River watershed and had great response response from local producers and landowners there, because not only did it help us in terms of modeling stream flow in Iowa, but it helped those landowners in this very wet and cool spring make planting and cropping decisions. And so that kind of information does provide a multifaceted use. The information that we have in our sensor network as well as in our models is all wrapped in the Iowa Flood Information System. And unfortunately, in the 10 minutes that I have today, I just wouldn't be able to do justice to go to the IFIS system and demonstrate all of its capabilities. But you can view all of the information from the federal stream gauge system, all the information from the Iowa Flood Center stream gauge system, all of the NextRad rainfall products, and the accumulation of rainfall over the last 14-day period. We have about 12 communities that we've provided inundation maps for, the largest 12 communities in Iowa, and that shows the extent of inundation throughout those communities for various stream flow gauges for the communities. And interestingly, in this last year, certainly in 2013, as we've been in existence for 4 or 5 years now, we were able to test a number of those systems. And we tested them to a level that was significant, but thankfully not as devastating as in 2008. And so we've gotten feedback from private citizens, business owners, communities, and state agency folks that use the Iowa Flood Information System to make day-by-day and hour-by-hour decisions in terms of flood planning. In terms of infrastructure, another program that we're working collaboratively with the Department of Natural Resources on is the Iowa Statewide Floodplain Mapping Project. And that program is targeting all counties in Iowa. We, as a state, received funding from CDBG funds to update maps in the 85 presidentially declared disaster counties following the 2008 floods. And so we're doing that mapping project in conjunction with the DNR. We're providing all of the technical map products, and the DNR is the entity of contact in Iowa for floodplain management. And so they're working directly with FEMA in going through the FEMA certification and public review process on those maps. It's a 5-year project. As I had mentioned in the question that I asked earlier today, one of the products from this map program is to get the 5-year, the 10-year, 25, 50, 100, 200, and 500-year levels of delineation for all rivers and streams in Iowa. And we're modeling streams all the way down to the smallest streams, the ephemeral type streams that come off of ag lands that drain areas as small as 1 square mile. And so this is a very comprehensive program. It'll be very unique to the nation, and we believe that level of mapping could provide a number of different pilots for our national mapping program. It starts with hydrography and determining where the stream center lines are, hydrology, river hydraulics, and then mapping, and results in, this is just a county level map that shows one level of delineation overlaid on a Google Map platform. And so all the information will be served up on the internet, allowing anybody to go and search their own property, either by address or by map, and see where their home, their business, or their agricultural lands lie with respect to the floodplain. So we think it's a tremendous service. The progress on the project is that we're moving across the state. We started in southwest Iowa. We've completed mapping in about 1/3 of the state. We've completed the hydrography in the entire state. And so as we move across, we go through those 4 phases of the project. Hydrography is done across the whole state, hydrology about half of the state. The final map products are produced for about 1/3 of the state. And so we look to wrap it up in the next couple of years. Where I'd like to focus my last couple minutes, I think maybe I have about 5 minutes left, is talking about infrastructure, and this is watershed infrastructure and I would say intellectual capital in the state. You might be aware that there have been a number of watershed management authorities that have formed in Iowa in the last couple of years. In fact, the English River watershed, which is probably the most recently formed watershed, isn't on this map. But these are watersheds that have come together to try to solve water-related problems in their watershed, not from a county or a city perspective, but from a watershed perspective. Again, the Department of Natural Resources is doing a great job in leading this program. We're working closely with a number of the watersheds providing technical services. We have a project that we call the Iowa Watersheds Project. It's funded through Housing and Urban Development, and it has a primary objective to plan, implement, and evaluate watershed projects to lessen the severity and frequency of flooding in Iowa. And that question came from 2008, when there were a number of folks particularly those that were trying to solve the flood mitigation project in Cedar Rapids, that asked a specific question. If that project of flood protection in Cedar Rapids, and let's say it's $500 million, if we spent $500 million of watershed improvements, could we have prevented what had happened in Cedar Rapids from happening again? And, you know, the tough answer to that is that we didn't know. Certainly we could have lessened the severity of flooding, but could we have prevented it by keeping the floodwaters inside the levee system in Cedar Rapids? So we've picked a few watersheds. We have a phase 1 and phase 2 approach to the project. We're in phase 1. We're doing some hydrologic assessment of 4 watersheds in Iowa. In phase 2, we're actually going out and constructing projects in 3 sub-watersheds in Iowa. And the watersheds that we were working with in the phase 1 hydrologic assessment were the Turkey, the Upper Cedar, the Middle Raccoon, and the Soap and Shequest Creeks in southern Iowa. So we've done the hydrologic assessment there. We're now in the process of identifying project locations for the Huck 12 watershed of Otter Creek in the Turkey River, of Bear Creek in the Upper Cedar, and down in Shequest Creek, Iowa. So how much impact could we hope to have in this kind of project? What we're doing in those constructed projects are building farm ponds, wetlands, connected floodplains where we have repetitive agricultural loss from flooding, allowing those floodplains to function again. And the example that we use is down in Soap Creek. And this is a project in Soap Creek that began in the mid-'80s by a bunch of landowners that stepped forward and said, our practices are changing the hydrologic response of our rivers and streams. And they wrote a plan, or had assistance from NRCS and Soil and Water Conservation District folks help them write a plan. And the plan was published in 1986. And since 1986, they've gone and installed 132 projects in their watershed. Every single one of them, and Paul would be interested in this, was really the benefit cost was determined based on a local secondary roads bridge. So most of the time they were able to replace a crumbling 100-year-old overhead truss secondary roads bridge with a corrugated metal pipe or concrete box culvert because of the reduced flow based on a single project installation. But nobody went back and tried to assess what the hydrologic benefit or stream flow benefit was of constructing those 132 projects. So we build mathematical models. We're modelers by trade in our program, and we can go back and look at different periods of time. So in 1993, there were a few projects that were built, about 250 square miles in the total watershed. About 5 square miles were upstream of the few projects that were constructed. In 99, we had a few more projects, 2005, 2008, and finally by 2012, 132 of these projects controlling about 24% of the watershed. And these are projects that are built with standard NRCS type 50-year designs. And anybody have any sense for what kind of benefit we could get from that type of project? Well, if we go in the upper part of the watershed where the projects are more intensely constructed, we see about a 74% reduction in stream flow for the 100-year rainfall event. That's 7.5 inches of rainfall in 24 hours. That's a lot of rain. And we see a 74% reduction in stream flow at the upper end. 47% reduction as you go further down, 43%, and about 40% reduction in stream flow at the outlet of this watershed in southern Iowa. And so that's a good kind of role model or analogy for how we could apply this type of distributed storage, working closely with landowners. As we went into the Upper Cedar and the Turkey, again, remember this is in a time when agricultural productivity and commodity prices are very, very high. There were some landowners that were skeptical and said, gosh, this just isn't going to work in our watershed because of the importance of producing row crops at this time. But what's been interesting, and that's been working closely with Soil and Water Conservation District officers, we've had absolutely no trouble in spending about $5 million in constructed projects. In fact, in those counties or in those watersheds, we have a long queue of people that are interested in having a project on their site because, again, it enhances their experiences and their lives, because every one of the projects in Soap Creek, all 132, they either have sand on the beach, a small dock to fish from, or a little john boat floating out in the edge of the water, because those folks like to recreate as well. And so we get...
start wrapping up?
Yep, we get very good technical data from this. The depth stored, or the amount of rainfall that gets stored. You can see some of these projects actually filled completely full. Others had some capacity left in it. It's all part of the mathematical modeling. The percentage that's utilized in each one of those projects, we can analyze that and look at it from a system perspective, where we would actually need more capacity or less capacity as we move this project forward. We think it can change the landscape in Iowa in a way that protects our agricultural economy and helps to serve our urban areas further downstream. And so we're very excited about the project. We can do some simple assessments within that watershed as well to identify places where they would be most suitable for the next projects to come online. And so with that, I will pass it on to Mark Schouten.
Thank you, Larry. My name is Mark Schouten. I'm the Director of Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management. I started in this position 2 years ago, December in 2011, after we had just finished the Missouri River flooding in western Iowa. In 2012, we shifted to droughts, and we worked extensively with the rural water associations. This year in 2013, we went back to flooding. We've had 4 presidential declarations throughout the state, and we don't know what next year will hold. So how has emergency preparedness and response efforts in Iowa changed as our weather has changed? Since 2008, we've had 14 presidential declarations, disaster declarations. Every county in the state of Iowa is covered by a presidential declaration. Some counties have 6. We're currently managing those 14 disaster declarations. Some started before 2008. We have $2.3 billion in total disaster recovery funding right now. Here's a map of the state that shows all those presidential disaster declarations, typically significant amounts of damage in each county. This chart shows 5-year average disaster funding. It's a 5-year average, but you can see what happened in 2008. 2008, we hope that it, like 1993, was a low probability, high consequence event or a black swan event. We're not so sure right now that in fact was the case. You can see now, though, that we're working our way out of the effects of the 2008 disaster in terms of the funding amount. This shows total disasters managed by year from 1990 through 2013. Again, you can see that same significant increase. So what have we learned from this experience? I think it's clear from an agency standpoint, we've learned that all disasters are local. We deal with weather. We don't necessarily deal with climate. We deal with the consequences of weather, and so we've had to work with local emergency managers in order to respond to these disasters as they occur. We've also learned that we need a trained and ready staff to carry out disaster recovery activities. Back in '93, we ramped up. We were down in terms of staff by 2008, only having to ramp up again just to handle those $2.3 billion worth of disaster funding through FEMA. We also learned that we need increased mitigation resources. We need to harden infrastructure. We need to acquire property from known flood zones. We have to do that pre-planning that will decrease the amount of damages that occur in the future. So we pre-positioned assets for local emergency management. Here's a map of what we've done with generators. Some 17 generators stationed now throughout the state of Iowa. They're GPS equipped, they're on wheels, and they are given to emergency managers with a MOU that requires them to share them and to move them where the generator may be needed in terms of winter ice storms or flooding or who knows what. We've also done the same with pumps. We pre-positioned 31 pumps throughout the state so they too can move where the pumping is needed. The emergency managers are pleased to have these because these are resources that sometimes they need, and they need on very short order. We're also developing a core public assistance staff. We don't want to repeat what we did in 2008, that is build one from scratch. We need a staff that's trained and ready to do the work, and one that's prepared for future disasters also. Hazard mitigation projects, very significant. Since 2007, we've used $501 million in FEMA dollars for hazard mitigation. You need to understand that when there's a disaster in a state and it's presidentially declared, FEMA comes in and pays for that public assistance that qualifies, that are for eligible projects. As part of that, FEMA will give 15% of the total damages for flood mitigation purposes. And so since 2007, our office has administered $501 million for hazard mitigation projects, used $200 million to harden 3,000 miles of REC power lines. As Dee noted, FEMA's particular about who they give their money to. They don't give it to private entities. They give it to RECs, and the RECs in Iowa have been certainly significant beneficiaries of those dollars. More than 900 properties have been removed from flood hazard areas. Cedar Rapids is one of those big areas where there was a lot of properties purchased, particularly on the west side of the river in Cedar Rapids. We look at 2013 and see that we avoided some $38 million in damages because of those property acquisitions that have been done since 2008. We also use the hazard mitigation dollars for tornado safe rooms. Some $52 million have been used for tornado safe rooms. 39 of those have been placed in schools. So what about policy matters? What initiatives do we have? I want to piggyback on what Paul said. GIS is the language of emergency management. I wouldn't have thought that when I started a couple of years ago, but the flood inundation maps, the stuff that Larry puts out, the stream gauges that we have, really provide amazing resources on notice events such as floods. And if you don't believe that, you should have been in Johnson County in May and June of this year and sat in on their meetings at the Emergency Operations Center, where they tried to predict where the flood was going to occur in the Iowa City area, and they were working with the Corps of Engineers and their projections, who in turn was working with Larry's folks, looking at the stream gauges upstream from the Coralville Reservoir, making predictions of what the reservoir level was going to be and what the discharge rate had to be and what type of flooding that was going to cause in Iowa City. A very delicate process, but a process that did not happen in that way in 2008 and clearly was unheard of in 1993. And so the technology, GIS, Paul's doing LRS, that's something we're waiting to be done, because we will certainly use it and work it into our next generation 911 systems. Also ties into what we're doing with statewide messaging. We have released a request for production or a request for proposal today for a statewide messaging system that can be used in notice events. Flooding is a notice event where you have a little bit of lead time, where you can communicate with the public, particularly those who lie in flood-prone areas and tell them what's going to happen based on flood inundation maps and suggest to them that it may be time for them to evacuate. You need a system to communicate with them, and we think now the technology in that area too has gone to the point where you can drop a message in a very small area using cell phones that nearly everyone is carrying at this time. And so we're interested in using that technology because we're discovering that weather radios don't seem to cut it anymore. You can't send out a radio alert to a broad area and expect that people are going to respond to it. They want a message that's tailored to their locality specifically, and the technology exists for that to be done. The last policy change item I want to talk about is the Iowa Flood Mitigation Board. We'll talk about it a little more in the next panel discussion, but passed by the legislature 2 years ago, signed by the governor, and it has allocated some $600 million to be used for flood mitigation projects over the next 20 years. The Mitigation Board met on December 4 and awarded $390 million to 6 cities throughout the state. There'll be more applications next year. We have 3 or 4 cities who are interested in the remaining dollars, and we expect that the effect of these flood mitigation monies, at least in those cities, have a significant opportunity to make flooding a thing of the past. Thank you.
Well, now it's our turn. We get to ask our panel anything that piqued your curiosity, follow-up questions and/or comments. So I could get the ball rolling. Question in the back. Can I ask the panel first to restate the question for our video audience?
I'll try to do that.
Right.
Okay, I believe the question is, what is Alliant doing to reduce basically usage and diversify? Alliant has a wide variety of generation options. We're very much involved with wind. We do still have some coal-fired power plants, however, they're much less than they used to be. And the ones that we do have are being retrofitted so that they are very environmental friendly. They're as friendly as a coal power plant can be. And then we're also moving towards more natural gas fired generation. So that's on the generation side, the different things that we're doing. We do have a very aggressive and have had one of the most aggressive energy efficiency plans. And we just had a new one renewed by the state, by the Iowa Utilities Board. It did get some press when it was renewed that some people didn't think it went far enough. But we have done a lot to reduce usage. We do a lot to encourage customers. We have a distributed generation program whereby customers can install distributed generation if they choose to do so. And then there's programs on how we pay for that. We have a very aggressive energy efficiency program, from switching to LED lights, compact fluorescent lights, home audits, all that type of stuff. So we do take that very seriously, because the more we can reduce energy usage, the less we have to look at building additional power plants. Does that answer your question? The question was, do we have programs to promote solar? And I'll be honest with you, I don't get involved with our energy efficiency program that much, so I don't know all the specifics of that. I don't know if there's something specific to solar. I believe there is, but I can't say for sure that there is. That's just not an area that I get involved with.
Well, thank you for that answer. Next.
Mhm.
How much does extreme weather and associated climate change weigh into your planning activities? What are you projecting into the future, and how are you hedging what may happen?
The question was how are we hedging what we've learned in the past from the major events to improve for the future? And really what we're doing, one, we are hardening the system from a perspective that we went from a Class C construction to Class B on overhead lines, which will be a stronger system. We do underground, probably more than we used to. The cost of undergrounding is coming down. Again, there is a trade-off because with underground, if you have a fault, it takes longer to find it, especially in winter-type conditions. A lot of new neighborhoods obviously are going in underground. So you're seeing more, we're starting to put in a little bit more rural underground. But from a cost-effective perspective, we're continually balancing the cost for our ratepayers, for our customers to pay for the system versus the undergrounding system. And undergrounding is usually at least 5 times the cost. So if you think about that from a long-term perspective on the cost of that the ratepayers pay, there's a balance that we have to keep for people to be able to afford the service. From a generation perspective, in Cedar Rapids, specifically around Prairie Creek, we built a wall around it that we can finish in very short notice, and we're getting ready to finish that this spring when the waters rose. Luckily, we didn't have to. Again, substations we're relocating wherever possible out of floodplains so that they're not impacted from that or building them up on platforms. But again, all the challenges that you have of trying to site those facilities, because it's just not something people want in their neighborhood. They don't want them in their backyard. So it's a balance that we strike.
Oh, thank you. I have a question from the audience, directed to Paul. As one of the state's largest landowners, could you speak to the DOT's work to use the right-of-ways as a retention area?
Well, we're doing 2 things. I don't have to repeat the question, do I? So,
No, but I can.
Okay. One is we have a pretty strong program at really vegetation within the right-of-ways in that essence of just trying to control erosion and other issues that gets into our ditches. We have been really working with DNR to talk a little bit about how to either retain water in a lot of different areas. A lot of that standard has changed significantly, and so just the water movement, depending on a project or how it connects into sort of that tributary area, has become more prevalent, I'd say, in the last 5 years to 6 years. From a standard perspective. So it's one of the areas that we have to deal with, which means that we likely purchase at times much more land than we have in the past, just in order for us to build either detention and or retention areas within the roadway system.
Paul, if I could add to that, in the project that we're working on up in the Turkey River watershed, there's a number of counties that have come together to look at, on a county road infrastructure, trying to hold water back at the county level. And one of the elements that they are, say, struggling with but still trying to resolve is exactly what type of easements and what type of encroachment they would have on private lands. And so for it to have much value, it's got to go off of the right-of-way and onto private lands. And some landowners are quite willing because of the type of land that would be encroached upon. Others are trying to figure out what the reimbursement model should be. So folks are looking at it at the county level as well.
Oh, thank you. Question in the back here?
Okay, all right, I wasn't sure. You know, what I just want to go back to what Larry had presented, to talk a little bit about, you know, if you think about replacing old structures or other issues, and looking at sort of that tributary overall system is really a key ingredient for us, I think, in the future. We've had a lot of conversation, especially about the rural system, and trying to understand, you know, the essence of what to rebuild. You know, what's the right structure? Where do you actually go? How do the counties, much less the department, make those decisions? And I think, you know, as I heard Larry speak this morning, I actually have quite a few ideas, but one of the things that I think is very important is for us to overlay that a little bit further. Typically, we have not had that sort of process where we've gone out and really looked at the watershed system. We're really sort of focused on the traffic and trying to accommodate that. And that's not necessarily then assessing the potential impact, especially from a climate change perspective, to the system. And I think that, to me, is part of the key ingredient for us to do in the future.
And I'd also like to add a comment to Mary's question, and that is, on the HUD project that we have, we started that project thinking much more broadly and more comprehensive to include many different types of mitigation and methods to hold water, increase infiltration. Interestingly, when we had originally proposed that project through the governor's office to HUD, they were very excited about it, and they saw that this was a one-of-a-kind project, and so they asked us to write up in a page or less exactly what we were going to do with $8.8 million. And when they realized that we weren't going to spend it all just on planning, that we actually wanted to go into the field and do project constructions, then that really started to stretch administratively what their administrative opportunities were or latitudes were. And so we ended up about a 14-month contract negotiation and ended up with a much narrower suite of projects that we made available to those watersheds. That being said, there's no question that major river restoration projects have a similar benefit. Certainly those need to be thought of along a longer reach through a corridor of a river or a small catchment. And I think would be a tremendous opportunity somewhere in the state to start focusing resources like had been done in Catfish Creek. I fully support it.
One question, again, from the audience on a card. Mark?
Yes.
Can you discuss future planning for, and this is underlined, long-term recovery and importance of partners in planning and implementation?
Yeah, we are in the process right now of the question deals with long-term recovery. We are in the process right now of rewriting our long-term recovery plan. It is, I think if it's anything we've learned over the last, since 2008, is that you need to have that plan into effect. You have to have one in place. You need to be able to activate it. And then more importantly, or most importantly, you need to have the right partners because we act as a coordinating entity, but the heavy lifting is done by the DOT, it's done by economic development, it's done by DNR. When does recovery begin? It begins probably while the disaster is still pending, while the response is still being made, but those steps need to be started as soon as they can be started so that people begin to think the long term so that they can begin planning on how things are going to look 5 or 10 years down the road. And I say 5 or 10 years because that's what it's taking some cities. Cedar Rapids has made a great deal of progress, but they, I think, have a long-term plan in mind for their recovery, and they're not yet done. And the funding that they're receiving from the Flood Mitigation Board and the Iowa Legislature will allow them to complete a project that's going to take another 20 years to be completed. So the long and long-term recovery needs to be emphasized, but because of its length, one should not underestimate its importance. Clearly, we see the importance of a city immediately beginning to grapple with the long-term issues.
Well, thank you, Mark. One more question? Oh,
This is for Director Schouten. My concern relates to the new policy of actuarially sound national flood insurance policy quick moves. And my question for you is that my concern is over the next 5 years, as these premiums are radically ramped up, I'm afraid we're going to be less prepared to recover floods in the state. And has your agency asked the governor, local legislature, for additional funding in order to help communities participate in the community rating system, or to get earlier access to the flood modeling at the flood center in order to help contain these premium costs?
Yeah, the question concerns the flood insurance program, what our agency is doing with it, whether we are working with the flood center on the modeling they're doing. We're clearly supporting what they're doing with their modeling. We certainly wish they were done today or tomorrow, but we understand the complexity of that project. The flood insurance program is a national program, but it clearly has local implications, and we've heard anecdotally too the stories of people whose rates have increased astronomically because suddenly they're asked to bear the total cost of living by a river and incurring the full cost of that flood potential. We haven't taken any definite steps yet. We're watching it. You may well know that David Miller, my predecessor at Homeland Security Emergency Management, now works for FEMA, and he is in charge of the mitigation directorate and actually has day-to-day control over the flood insurance program. So we've talked with him. We'll continue to talk with him, and but we have not yet found out what our niche has to be in that issue. If people continue to live by rivers, and if those mitigation efforts are not put into effect, and we have another 2008 flood, but in a different place, we're going to see damages like we saw in 2008. So if flood insurance causes people to pay the full cost of living next to a river, from an economic standpoint, that may not be an entirely bad thing, but it certainly works a short-term hardship for those people who have to pay the increased rates.
All right, well, our time is coming close to the end. I'd like to extend my thanks to the panel for presenting great information, and also extend the conference organizers thanks for participating today. So as a group, could we thank the panel?